That was President Nixon in 1983, reflecting on his remarkable record in office. And what a fitting way to begin our final Nixon seminar on conservative realism and national security. I'm your host, Mary Kissel, and it's my great honor to be with you tonight, broadcasting live from the Nixon Library in Yorba Linda, California, alongside fellow seminar member Kimberly Reed. Other distinguished seminar members, as you can see on your screens, are joining us virtually. Ambassador O'Brien, our co-chair, will be with us online shortly. Secretary Mike Pompeo will also be joining us later in the program. And we welcome a special guest, former National Security Advisor Stephen Hadley. Sir, we're so happy to have you with us. But before I begin, I also want to acknowledge and remember our honorary chairman, the late Henry Kissinger, who was with us for the very first seminar that we held of this series in March of 2021. So tonight, we'll reflect on what we've learned about President Nixon as a man, as an intellectual, as a foreign policy practitioner, as president, and how to apply his wisdoms to today's many challenges. We're also going to talk about how to recruit and train the next generation of foreign policy leaders, which of course was a goal of this seminar series from the beginning. So let's get started. And to the audience here, we're delighted to have you come and be with us. And to those who are watching virtually, we invite you to come to the library. Don't just watch the seminar, come in person. It's a remarkable place. Well, Stephen Hadley, former National Security Advisor, it's the first time that we've hosted you, and a great time to have you with us to help close the seminar. And sir, I think I might kick it off with you to start with some reflections about Richard Nixon, the man, Richard Nixon, the intellectual. Frame the discussion for us about how this president is viewed today in the light of history. Thank you, sir. I think we've got him on mute.
You'd think after all this time on Zoom, we would know how to unmute ourselves. Thank you. It's great to be with you. And I had the privilege of serving under President Nixon for a couple months in 1974. And one of the things I got to do was read the transcripts of his National Security Council meetings. And they were extraordinary documents, very detailed, but the grasp he had of the world and what it meant for American interests and how to pursue American interests in that world was really unprecedented. Monica Crowley and I were talking a little bit before the show began. And Monica, if it's all right with you, I'm going to steal your line. She said that President Nixon was a visionary in the sense that he had a view of where the world was heading, what that would mean for the United States, and how the United States should pursue its interests in that changing world. That was her definition of a visionary. And I think it's a good definition, and I think that is who Richard Nixon was. And I think that vision is now, I think, historically being appreciated in a way perhaps that it was forgotten at the time because of all the events surrounding the conclusion of his time in office. So I think he's a real example for all of us, and a real example for what you want in your president. You want a president who can be a visionary that way, because Robert O'Brien may have a different view, but my experience was the president is usually the chief strategist of his administration or her administration. That is the president who really sees across the full spectrum of issues at the highest level. And it's really, I think, in most instances, the chief strategist for the president's administration. And the more visionary a president you're able to serve, the luckier you are. And the people who served Richard Nixon were very lucky indeed.
The chief strategist of the administration, well, certainly one of the advantages that President Nixon had was his incredible life experience as a veteran, a lawyer, a congressman, a senator or vice president, a man who had traveled around the world, who personally knew world leaders from Asia to Latin America and beyond. So Monica Crowley, since the former National Security Advisor just stole your line, clearly we have to go to you next. And again, I really want you to give the audience a sense of who he was as someone who knew him personally and interacted with him and worked with him on texts. Give us a sense of Richard Nixon, the man and the intellectual.
Well, thank you so much, Mary, for the question. And Steve, thank you very much for stealing my line, but also for those very kind words about President Nixon, because he truly was a visionary. And Steve and I were saying before we began, I was saying that, my definition of visionary is somebody who could see what the world was going to look like 20, 30, 40 years down the road, and then make American policy in the moment, in high office, to anticipate that world. I think the United States has had a few visionaries as president, but Richard Nixon was certainly one of them. I came to President Nixon in the last years of his life. I worked with him in the final 4 years of his life. And I think that's when Richard Nixon was probably the most complete of a man he would ever be, like most of us are when we reach our final days. And so therefore, he was really reflective on his life and career. We spent a lot of time talking about American foreign policy as it was under his presidency, and then, of course, after he left the presidency. And I can tell you that Richard Nixon was a true intellectual. He considered himself a loner, but he was really much better at retail politics than he gets a lot of credit for. But he was a true intellectual in that he could sit with the great works and reflect on them, and then come out with original thinking and original ideas on American policy, domestic and foreign, but also how to project original ideas into the future and then make concrete policy and get it through the sausage making process of the foreign policy apparatus once he became president. That's not an easy feat, and not a lot of presidents can do that. But Nixon took his responsibilities as steward of American foreign policy extremely seriously. So seriously that, of course, he changed the world when he was president. Of course, he was a peacemaker, which was his highest definition of a successful leader. A peacemaker, and he used to quote scripture all the time in his books and speeches about how being a peacemaker is really the highest calling. So as president, of course, he wound down the war in Vietnam. He ended the draft. He opened the door to China. He instituted détente with the Soviet Union. He had shuttle diplomacy in the Middle East to try to achieve a more enduring peace in that region. He was making peace sometimes out of necessity because of the tremendous drain of the war in Vietnam on our resources and political will to be more aggressive, say with the Soviet Union, for example. So his creativity and imagination in dealing with a very restricted bag of tricks and resources to come up with, say, opening the door to China as a tremendously imaginative policy to try to use China as a counterweight against growing Soviet power in that era. That kind of creative thought in policy, I think, is very rare among our leaders. Most of them are tinkerers. Most of them are reactive. Many of them are domestic policy oriented and not foreign policy oriented. So all of these things, where all of these gifts and talents and passions of Richard Nixon on the world stage, understanding geopolitics, understanding America and America's place in the world, and how to advance those interests in a changing world, I think that made Richard Nixon certainly one of our greatest foreign policy presidents, probably one of our greatest presidents of all time.
So well put, Monica. Thank you so very much. And I see that we have co-chair Ambassador O'Brien on the line by the wonders of technology. Ambassador, welcome to the conversation. We've just kicked off by talking about Richard Nixon, the man, the thinker, the practitioner. And one of the reasons I think I've found this seminar so special, Kim, I don't know if you agree, but we think of our current day and age as chaotic, unruly, unprecedented, and yet when President Nixon came into office, when you think of the challenges that he was dealing with, and many of you actually, of course, experienced this with your spouses in the draft for Vietnam or experiencing the economic upheavals of that age. It too was a very tumultuous time. And Ambassador, just wanted to give you the opportunity at the opening of the seminar to talk a little bit about the manner in which Richard Nixon approached these challenges and the framework of his thinking. Welcome, sir.
Thank you, Marion. It's great having Stephen Hadley, who's a mentor and a friend of mine. And when I was National Security Advisor, he was always available and gave me great advice and wisdom, and especially helping with the transition. So, Stephen, great to have you with us, and thank you for joining us tonight. And I think the influence of Richard Nixon, and you heard Stephen Hadley talk about having worked for him for the last few months. Monica worked for him and had the opportunity to work very closely with one of his books. Dr. Kissinger, who's no longer with us, but started the seminar with us, and together with Mike Pompeo and myself, that was an honorary co-chair of this very seminar, was his national security advisor and his partner. So just the influence on the people he had. I think of Mike and myself, who are kind of the same age, 58 and 60, and we grew up as middle-class kids in Southern California and Orange County, and Richard Nixon was a middle-class kid, probably lower middle class. We didn't know it. No one knew they were middle class or poor in California back in those days. It was just the American dream, the California dream. And I think of the tumultuous time that you talk about, Mary, that Richard Nixon came into office as president, but he brought with him these quintessentially American values. He was from Indiana. His family was from the Midwest, and my great-grandparents and grandparents knew the Nixons in Indiana and knew them when they were out in California. And we had the treasured pictures on our wall where my mom and aunt with President Nixon's mom at their Orange Grove and Lemon Grove. So he brought these Midwestern values to a very tumultuous world. And it was just this American exceptionalism that he believed in. But he was also realistic about our power. He didn't want to fight every war. He knew there were limits to what we could do as America, but he also understood that we were the indispensable power, that we could have a role to play. Maybe not, refighting every war or, expending all of our resources on any given problem, but he also knew that any given problem could only be solved with American input and with American leadership. And so it was very realistic in his foreign policy. It was practical. He brought that Midwestern sense of practicality to what we could do and where we could make a difference and where we might have to be a little bit more modest in our goals. And he brought a level of he brought some leaven to the bread and some oil to the water to a very tumultuous, difficult time, basically ending the Vietnam War, or putting us in a position to end the Vietnam War, achieving detente with the Soviets and lowering the temperature in the Cold War. And doing those things in a foreign policy sense that allowed the American people to kind of wrestle with some of the demons and some of the issues that we were facing domestically. And so I think there was an intertwining between him bringing some calm and some peace and some normality to the world and allowing that to happen at home. Now, of course, it ended a little tough with Watergate and the impeachment proceedings, but I think in hindsight now, people are looking back at the Nixon years as very good years for the country. And they're looking at him, as Monica pointed out, as if not a genius, a real intellectual president who understood foreign policy and understood America's role in the world and demonstrated the leadership that we needed to give our place as the indispensable power. So, again, honored to be here with all of you. Mary, you've done a great job co-hosting. I want to give a shout out to another Orange County guy. He's originally also another guy who was originally from the Midwest, from Ohio, and that's Hugh Hewitt. And this wouldn't have gotten started without Jim Byron, the president of the foundation, and Hugh. And this seminar arose out of Hugh's vision. He called Mike and myself and said, "Hey, I think we can do this." And we got Henry involved and got it started. But the idea was to put together. It wasn't about us. It wasn't about Mike or myself or Dr. Kissinger. It was about the people that we could put together on the seminar, the Monica and Crowley's and Kim Reed's and Alex Wong's and Mike Waltz's and Mike Gallagher's and I'm going to leave a bunch of people out, but Morgan Ortegas, who's going to be a great leader in the country, already is a great leader, and is going to be a great leader in the country. But we've got all these wonderful people in the seminar, and it's about all of them, and we've seen their wisdom and their their creativity and their thoughtfulness over the past 2.5 years, 3 years. And I've said this before, but that's what gives me hope for the future of the country, is to see this generation of terrific leaders who are going to, whether it's President Trump in January 2025 or some future president down the road, Republican president. We've got a great bench of just terrific, fantastic leaders who are going to lead the country well with the great American values and the ingenuity and thoughtfulness and creativity that President Nixon showed when he was in office. So honored to be with all of you.
Thank you very much for that. Opening statements are over, and I'm going to start moving along the seminar. And we're going to start talking about specific issues. Just as Richard Nixon dealt with actually many of the same problematic nation states, like China, like Russia, in different forms, as we are today. So I want to talk about those specific areas and relate them to some of the problems that we're facing today. And since I have Kim Reed sitting here next to me, I think she gets privilege of the first question as we talk about challenges we're facing today. And let's start with Israel. Obviously facing an existential threat. We've talked several times, we've actually held several seminars specifically on Israel's war against the Iranian proxy Hamas, as well as, of course, they face threats from Hezbollah. But Richard Nixon, strong supporter of Israel. Let's recall 1973, he said, send everything you can fly to support Israel during the Yom Kippur War after Egypt and Syria's surprise attack. What can we learn from that, Kim? I mean, speak a little bit to President Nixon's example there and talk about the lessons for today.
Absolutely, and it's great to be at the Nixon Library. Again, if you've not been here, we are seated with some wonderful supporters in a model of the East Room of the White House. It's amazing. I encourage everyone to visit it. And Mary, to your point, let's talk about Richard Nixon in Israel. I also know outside of this museum is where Richard Nixon grew up. We have his childhood home. And I think his Quaker upbringing instilled a work ethic that is so important to all that we're discussing today and setting forth the foreign policy that we are focused on. And we know that he had many trials and tribulations. But what I like best generally about Richard Nixon is that he was a realist. He looked at foreign policy situations, I think, from the view of those involved in the situation. Unlike our current administration, who looks at it from a utopian Harvard Columbia textbook view, which might be great in the perfect world, but the moment that we start tilting towards Iran or Syria or Lebanon and away from Israel or great Abraham Accord countries like Saudi Arabia, we're getting into mighty, mighty problems.
Well, Kim, you mentioned the Abraham Accords. Can we tie that back to Nixon to say that that was a creative way to look at a situation that had been frozen for a very long time? I mean, Nixon reached out to Saudi Arabia, but also to Israel. He tried to balance American interests in the region, but also create new ties of peace.
Absolutely, and we're going to be talking, I believe, this evening about the Nixon Doctrine, and I'll just kind of do a preview of that. This was started with a very famous press conference that he did on my late mother's birthday, July 20th, 1967, 68, need to get that right, but 69. And he was in Guam, and he was asked many questions about what was happening in the world. But one that he was asked was about his visit to communist Romania. And people were looking at that kind of skeptically. And he said, I hope of negotiation rather than confrontation. So I think that's a good thing. And I will say that Richard Nixon's legacy lives on today through the seminar, because as I've mentioned on previous seminars, back in October, several of the Nixon seminar members, Alex Gray, Christopher Nixon Cox, and Jim Byron, the head of the Nixon Library, we were in Qatar the day that the attack took place. And we were going to Israel right after that. We couldn't, but because we wanted to emphasize Richard Nixon's role 50 years ago in Israel. So in closing, I want to say hello to our National Security Advisor during the Bush administration, Stephen Hadley. In addition to Ambassador O'Brien, Mr. Hadley was very supportive of me in my own long confirmation process to become head of the Export-Import Bank. So hello, sir. It's nice to see you.
Long confirmation processes are unfortunately what happens today, but we're glad that we got through that. And Morgan Ortegas, you were just in Israel, and I wonder if you can speak a bit to the lessons of Richard Nixon and how he approached the Middle East, the relationship between Israel and the Arab nations. And when conflict came, his support was for Jerusalem. What say you about the lessons learned for today?
Thank you, Mary. It's hard going back to Israel at this time. This is the second time that I've been back since October 7th. I too was in the Middle East on October 7th and headed to Jerusalem for meetings, for economic meetings, integration between Arab states and Israel. And so it has been it's been very hard when I think, Mary, about the fact that you and I and Robert and Monica, that we all stood in the Rose Garden with the president and then on the South Lawn and watched President Trump make peace deals, historic peace deals between Israel and Arab states. And then to go to Israel right now, Mary, and to see what has happened, since October 7th, the worst killing of the Jewish people in a single day since the Holocaust. But I'm reminded, although we've had extreme highs and now extreme lows, extreme highs with Abraham Accords, extreme lows with October 7th, that things can change. And I think, one of the things that it involves is not letting politics guide your policy. And unfortunately, I think that that's the position that we're in today, that we're seeing outside forces and decisions being made as it relates to America's relationship with Israel, that in my opinion are being guided by politics in an election year instead of being guided by policy. But I bring all this back to Richard Nixon. I was just rereading the Nixon Doctrine announced on Guam. And I want to read a quick excerpt from the Nixon Doctrine, because I think it's so applicable to our ally Israel and so many of the conflicts that we see around the world. And Nixon said, the Nixon Doctrine announced on Guam was misinterpreted by some as signaling a new policy that would lead to total American withdrawal from Asia and from other parts of the world as well. Fast forward, I emphasized, as I said to our friends in the Asian countries, that the Nixon Doctrine was not a formula for getting America out of Asia, but one that provided the only sound basis for America staying in and continuing to play a responsible role. And essentially in that role, Mary, President Nixon said that he would only furnish material, military, economic assistance to those nations willing to accept the responsibility of supplying the manpower to defend themselves. And I think that's the type of realistic foreign policy that we are trying to get back to. It is often, and I write about this and talk about this quite a bit, especially on my show, that it is not isolationist to want to demand that your friends and your allies be in the fight and be willing to fight and defend for themselves. And that is, I think, the massive difference for me in the last month, having gone to both Israel and to Taiwan. When you're with the Israelis, they're saying, listen, we want the military aid, we want the support, but we're going to fight whether you give it to us or not, right? They're not a vassal state of the United States. Israel is not. They're going to fight to defend their people, to defend their sovereignty, to defend their country. And that's the kind of conversation, Mary, that I tried to have with the Taiwanese to make them understand. That is the kind of country that I think Americans, that's a type of people Americans want to help. When you have skin in the game and when you're willing to fight for yourself and when you're willing to put it all on the line for your country, then I think you enter a place where America can and should support. So that's how I think about the conflicts holistically, Mary, going on around the world. And as it relates to Israel, listen, if we can't fully stand by Israel, that means at the United Nations, at the ICC, and every forum and venue where it matters, then we won't be able to stand by anybody. Israel is the canary in the coal mine, especially to countries in the Middle East, to know if America is actually going to stand by their allies and their friends as we have committed to do.
An important comment. Thank you, Morgan. And I'd encourage everyone to go back and listen to some of the seminars that we've done on Israel and some of the comments that we've quoted of President Nixon from his writings, because he was very clear that every American president would support Israel as the essential democracy in the region. I also just want to clarify the Nixon Doctrine, because we've just had two people reference it, related to Asia and the question of how America would engage in Asia-Pacific. It wasn't isolationist, but President Nixon did set out some parameters to say, as Morgan just quoted, that we would support our friends who were willing to fight, but in the event of a nuclear exchange, President Nixon said, yes, we would use nuclear weapons. He was very clear about that. So, now that we're speaking of war, conflict, weapons, we should go to subterfuge and all of the rest. We've got the former head of the CIA and Secretary of State. How'd you like to? Sorry about that transition, sir. I just couldn't help myself. Co-chair Mike Pompeo, who has joined us, and Secretary Pompeo, we thank you for being with us, co-chairing the seminar. We first started off talking about Nixon, the man, the intellect, the practitioner. Now we're talking about specific parts of the world and lessons that we can learn from him. And I'd like to ask you about the opening to China. He gave a speech here at the Nixon Library about Nixon's legacy of the opening. But Nixon himself said that he feared he had created a Frankenstein. What are the lessons we can take from how the situation that Nixon faced at the time, the reasoning behind his opening, and how we might think of that relationship today, sir? Over to you.
Well, Mary, thank you. And I see Steve Hadley. Great to see you, my friend. Thanks for joining us as well. I apologize for being late. It's interesting. You asked that question on an important day, right? Here we are, June 4th, the anniversary of Tiananmen Square, where the Chinese government crushed a rebellion, killing its own people in a way that I think is indicative of the place the Chinese Communist Party finds itself today, ruling through an incredible authoritarian regime. Reel yourself back to the early 1970s, and President Nixon and Dr. Kissinger faced a very different challenge than the one that's confronting the world today. So, your point about where we find ourselves and the opening that was made to China, and I talked about that Frankenstein in those remarks in the spring of 2020 when I spoke from the hallowed grounds of the Nixon Library. And I spoke about the fact that what happened in the early 1970s might well have made sense at that time, and indeed as a strategic matter almost certainly did, but is no longer fit for purpose today in 2024 or then in 2020. The challenges that the globe face are primarily a result of a Chinese Communist Party with 1.4 billion people, the first or second largest economy in the world, and an effort to create a hegemonic capacity that has infiltrated just about every country in the world. And so, I had this debate with Dr. Kissinger before he passed. He never quite came to the view that I did, that saw the Chinese Communist Party in its current incarnation under Xi Jinping as the threat that I think most of us can see today. And so this idea that we can continue a model of unabridged engagement, allowing them to continue to have a set of rules at the World Trade Organization and the other international institutions that is a dominant position, that presents enormous risk. And whether it's their support of the North Korean regime, their support of the Russian regime, their support of the Iranian regime, all of these are indicators of the fact that it is in fact the Chinese Communist Party that does present that great threat to the United States in a way that it did not in 1972 relative to the then Soviet Union.
It's fascinating just how much our stance toward China has changed, and it's largely bipartisan these days. It's widely acknowledged that we face really not a competitor, but an enemy in communist China. And Richard Nixon was interesting when he spoke and wrote about China. He talked a lot about how we needed Asian nations to also come together to face that threat. And he saw that starting to happen decades before we woke up here, actually, in America. Steve Hadley, I'd love you to respond to what the Secretary just said. And I'd add, too, that you see corporate America waking up. You see foreign direct investment in China plummeting. Mr. Hadley, how do you view the China threat? And respond to Secretary Pompeo. Thank you, sir.
I did it again here. Sorry about that. One of the things that you all did in preparation for this is pointed us to an article that Richard Nixon had printed in Foreign Affairs called Asia After Vietnam. And he has, at the end of that article, talks about China, and it's very interesting. And in some sense, it's deja vu all over again. He says in that article that the point is to get China to not to seek to impose its will on the world or to be an expansionist, but to focus on its own internal development. And his strategy was to do that. And as you pointed out, one of the key elements of that strategy was to get our Asian friends and allies to pull together with us to put pressure on China and to show China that really that was the right course for China, was to focus on its internal development. And I would say that for a long period of time, under Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao, that policy, starting with Deng Xiaoping, of course, that policy seemed to succeed because China did seem to be internally focused on its own development. And the benefit was, of course, that hundreds of millions of Chinese came out of poverty. The problem, of course, is that leaders matter. And Xi Jinping had a different view and a different place that he wanted to take his country. And we're now back, oddly enough, in some measure, with the same dilemma that Nixon faced in 1972. What do you do about a China that is seemingly less and less focused on those things it needs to do for its own successful internal economic development and more focused on playing a more problematic role in the world? How do we roll that back? How do we convince China that that is not the right thing for China as well as for the rest of the world? I think allies are still very important because the China we're dealing with is a much more muscular China, economically, diplomatically, and militarily. And only with our friends and allies are we going to be able to muster the economic, diplomatic, and military wherewithal to try to have an impact on China and to see if we can turn it back towards the original vision that Richard Nixon had in his approach to China.
It's interesting, and it's such a shame that we don't have President Nixon here today. Wouldn't we love to hear what he would say after seeing, really, I think, the bare face of communism, which is what China is today. And I encourage you all to go back and listen to the seminars that we did on China. Of course, when we say they lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty, you could also say that they've kept hundreds of millions repressed. And in fact, China today should look like Taiwan. It should look like Korea. And I'd also note our friend Jimmy Lai. It looks like he's having some health difficulties. We've talked about him in prior seminars, and we hope very much for his release. I'd like to link China to Russia and turn to the problem of Putin. President Nixon, after he left office, was very adamant that the transition to democracy for Russia should be successful, not just for the Russian people, but also as a symbol for the Chinese people. Lan He-chen, we haven't gotten you into the conversation yet, and I want to pull you in here. Where did we go wrong? What did President Nixon see so early about the post-Soviet era in Russia, and what was going wrong that we missed?
Well, I think President Nixon was remarkably clear about, first of all, the contrast between communism and free enterprise, really at a time when people may have tried to shy away from that. He was very clear-eyed about the challenges presented in transitions out of communist societies and the degrees to which communist societies really presented some fundamental challenges. And so you could argue that part of really where we went wrong, or maybe not where we went wrong, but where things went wrong, was a failure to really recognize how significant of a challenge that transition from a communist system would be, and the dangers of communism, and thinking about not just the political elements. They're obviously very dangerous political and ideological elements, but just from the perspective of the functioning or non-functioning of an economy and how difficult it was to make that transition. I'll also say that, just to go back to the point about China for a minute, one of the things that was truly prescient in President Nixon's pronouncements. Certainly, if you look at the speech he gave at the Bohemian Grove, for example, in July of 1967, really talking about the need for us to focus our eyes on the challenges in the Indo-Pacific region, the challenges in Asia. And that goes to China. Arguably, it goes more broadly to the challenges in China and Russia that you're asking about, Mary. But the degree to which he was really focused on a part of the world that not many were, I think, was really remarkable. And then the last thing I might say about that transition really was the degree to which Nixon was really the first president to say we need to seriously rethink foreign aid. When a country is transitioning out of a particular system of economics like communism, which is, well, in the Soviet Union's case, it was worse than communism. It was communism combined with elements of Marxism and just outright repression. But when you make that kind of transition, there's a temptation to say, well, if we give them enough money, if only we gave them enough money or gave them enough help, that maybe that would have made the difference. And I think Nixon was really one of the first people to say, actually, maybe not so much. Maybe we need to think a little bit more carefully about how we think about foreign aid, how we think about our responsibilities versus the responsibilities of other nations versus the responsibility of the nation we're trying to help, quite frankly. So all of these themes, I think, are very much in line with the question you're asking, Mary, about not just the transition we hope we see one day in China, which is out of this communist repressive regime, but the one we had to face when we were coming out of an era where the Soviet Union was making that transition. And unfortunately, we're seeing some of the side effects of those challenges today.
Well, just to tease out some themes here, because I see the audience is very dour here. I'm sorry that we have to talk about so many negative topics. I promise you that we'll get to an uplifting one at the end. But I am starting to hear some very clear themes. President Nixon as a realist, that we need our president as the chief strategist to see the world as it is, not as we want it to be. As a creative peacemaker, the Abraham Accords and under Trump, President Nixon's outreach to Saudi Arabia in defense of Israel, recognizing the evil of communism and what it is. He talked, for instance, about the successes of Vietnam, the fact that it didn't spread down through Southeast Asia into Indonesia and those key areas of the world. Great success. Trying to get our allies to pull their own weight, as Lan He-chan just said, which is something else, which is another emerging theme today. So there are many ties that we have today to Nixon, many lessons that we can learn from his time in office. But I want to just make sure that we set aside some time here to talk about the future of foreign policy leadership, because that's something that we've tried to cultivate at the seminar. It's not all negative. There are positives here. There are leaders that we are cultivating, hopefully not just among the seminar members, but among society at large. And Kim, you had an experience yesterday that I just wanted to make sure I highlighted. It's another part of the Nixon Foundation and the efforts here to promote a realist foreign policy. Kim.
Well, Mary, we had a wonderful evening last night. The Nixon Library has a group called the Nixon Society for young people, people under 40. And we gathered last night at a home on Lido Island with about 50 of them. And we had a great discussion with them. And I can't tell you how uplifted I was. We met people like the president of the College of Republicans of America, Will Donahue. We met people not only from this area, but from other states. But collectively, we just had an outstanding, thoughtful discussion. And I want to encourage any young person to join this effort. And Mary, thank you for sharing your wisdom. She is a foreign policy dynamo. And I could tell that last night. Also, I want to say at lunchtime, I joined a group of individuals supporting a very important campaign here called the American Civics Campaign. Do you know that only 22% of America's 8th graders are proficient in civics? And only 1/3 of adults struggle to name all 3 branches of government, and 17% of Americans can't at all. And so this library is taking on a big initiative to help middle and high school students with that. And I encourage you to take a look at that and support that.
Well, thank you, Kim. And so the seminar has played many, many roles. It's played an educational role. It's played a role in kind of tying us all together as practitioners of foreign policy. It's played a role in the Yorba Linda community. We have people all over the world and across the country listening to us right now, and we appreciate all of you for your participation. Steve Hadley, I just want to go back to you for a moment and talk a little bit about how you see conservative foreign policy developing today, because it's a world different than it was in the Bush administration, because the world has changed. Do you see realism as taking a more prominent stance in our foreign policy thinking and in the practice of foreign policy?
Well, you were looking for some good news and what other was kind of a gloom and doom Zoom, if you will. And I think you've hit on one of the real good news stories is the young generation of conservative and Republicans who are stepping into and stepping up to foreign policy issues. I'm really impressed with these young people. A lot of them at this point in time have had experiences that are quite enriching, internships of one thing for another. A lot of them have lived overseas, studied overseas. They are well educated. I say to young people, you need to know something. You need to read a lot of history because it gives you context, and we're starving for context these days. We're drowning in news and starving for context. History will give you that context. You need to know some economics, and because markets are how we organize our economy, and you need to know something about the legal system. Young kids today are grounded in these things, are spending time overseas, are getting realistic perspectives of seeing how the rest of the world operates and bringing that back and enriching the conversation we have here. So, I think I'm quite optimistic about where we're going because of the young people that you're talking about and that you've had experience with in the last couple of days and are working with at the Nixon Library. So I think there's a lot of good news out there. And I think in some sense, the sooner some of us get off the stage and make room for these younger people, the better.
Well, thank you very much for that. Ambassador Bryan, if I could pull you in here as the chairman of the Nixon Foundation and a co-chair of the Nixon Seminar. Is the world simply intruding on us? Are we all becoming realists because the dangers are becoming so grave?
Well, I think they are. I appreciate Steve's comment about good news. I just got asked to give a speech for an organization, and paid speech, and so they get to call the shots. They said, would you please end it on a positive note for the audience? Because we love watching on Fox, but it's always bad news when we're watching it. Brian, so on a positive note. And I think the positive note is the one that Steve made, and I think it's when you look at the young people getting involved in politics and foreign policy, so many of them are veterans and are serving the country. They've served in Afghanistan, they've served in Iraq. They've seen their friends and comrades not come home from those conflicts, and that informs their views. And they want peace, and it's kind of counterintuitive, but the guys who fought in the front lines are the ones that the tip of the spear guys are the ones that are sometimes the greatest peacemakers. And I think we saw that with President Nixon. And you got to take a risk. And when we talk about the world intruding on us, we're going back to a time that's similar to when Nixon made the outreach to China, because we've got great power competition here. We've got Russia, we've got China, we've got India, we've got Europe, kind of all bouncing around. And President Nixon took a real risk going to China and sending Dr. Kissinger to China because, look, Mao was not a good guy, one of the great mass murderers of history. And the regime that they went and opened up was a terrible regime. And we may have to do something similar with Russia. We may have to try it. And this is something Mike and I both worked on when we were in office. I remember I went and saw Patrushev, the Russian National Security Advisor, and said, hey, China's going to make you a vassal state, and you're a Russian nationalist. You're a patriot. You don't want to be singing to Beijing's tunes. And so we're going to have to take some risks in foreign policy, and having some of these young people and And like some of the folks I didn't mention on the seminar that when I gave my opening talk, remarks, Lonnie Chen, Rich Colby, Alice Gray, Christopher Nixon Cox. I mean, and you can combine that with her on the phone today or the video conference today. Kim and you, Mary, we've got a great team of people that are going to be willing to take these risks, and we're going to have to give people a little more leeway to do tough things. And we can't let domestic politics intrude on every foreign policy initiative, because if we don't do some risky things, sometimes we're not going to be able to change the world. We've got to change the world. We've got to make it better for America, but better for our partners and democratic allies as well.
Monica Crowley, I want to bring you in. Do you agree with Ambassador O'Brien? And what do you think gave President Nixon that willingness to take risk? Was it his background? Was it his drive for peace that he prioritized above all else throughout his life? I mean, what allowed him to take these great leaps of foreign policy, Monica?
Well, I think, Mary, he genuinely believed in America. He was a true American patriot and believed in American power and thought long and hard about America's place in the world and how to exercise judiciously American power so that our interests were protected and defended, but also advanced. And we talked about Nixon as a visionary earlier in the seminar, but it was always about looking forward, a forward-looking foreign policy in order to ensure America's place in the world, protection of the United States, but also the advancement of those interests. You know, I also think that realism is grounded in common sense. And Nixon, as a Quaker growing up in the orange groves of Southern California, had a tremendous amount of common sense. And so he approached American foreign policy from a realist point of view, but it was essentially a non-ideological point of view. Yes, he was an anti-communist. Yes, he stood up to the Soviet Union. Yes, he brought all of that with him to inform his principles, to inform his foreign policy approach. But essentially it was realism grounded in common sense and a belief that the United States was the indispensable power in the world. How to retain that, how to keep that position in a world of very dangerous actors, and at a time when he was president, when the United States was tremendously constrained by the war in Vietnam, tremendous drain on our resources and political will domestically to act abroad. You know, the phrase peace through strength is often associated with Ronald Reagan because he spoke it, but Richard Nixon also embraced that philosophy as well. And he wanted to make sure that even though he was dramatically constrained as president, that the kind of creativity brought to American foreign policy would outlast him and outlast his presidency, and then inspire subsequent generations of foreign policy leaders, like several on our call today, including Stephen Hadley and Secretary Pompeo and Robert O'Brien and everybody on this call today. That kind of inspiration for creativity, thinking out of the box for American foreign policy, but exercising peace through strength, and really the personification of that in the American president. If you have a weak American president, and or if you have a United States that is either weak in real terms or perceived as weak, then of course the lesson is the wheels come off the world and the bad guys advance and the good guys retreat. Richard Nixon knew that the persona of the American president had to project American strength and power, and then of course backed up with American foreign policy through the national security apparatus. So I would just say that as somebody who became fascinated by national security and American foreign policy at the age of 20, having read one of President Nixon's latest foreign policy books at the time, I would just say, in order to inspire younger people to have this kind of passion for American foreign policy and to become a leader in this area that we're also passionate about, I think it's really important to talk to them in common sense terms, realist terms, about the importance of U.S. leadership in the world, America's place in the world, our values, and also peace through strength, because I think instinctively they are there. And I also think that all these generations, straight through to Gen Z right now, they're very used to growing up in a world where the United States is number one. And now we have a very serious existential enemy in the Chinese Communist Party. And the idea that perhaps they would come to adulthood or have their adulthood in a world where the United States was no longer number one, I think that's energizing a lot of young people to pay ever close attention to American leadership and the necessity for continuing that and strengthening American power in the world.
And as Ambassador O'Brien said, it's wonderful to see people with different backgrounds coming into the foreign policy field, of veterans who've experienced real threats, real hardship, those from business backgrounds coming in, bringing different ideas, creative solutions. Lanhee Chen quoted President Nixon's talk at the Bohemian Grove back in 1969. There was another quote from that speech that I think fits in nicely with what Monica just so eloquently said. And here it is. President Nixon said, quote, "Whether peace and freedom survive in the world depends on American leadership. There is only one area where there is any question. That is whether America has the national character and moral stamina to see us through this long and difficult struggle." What an appropriate quote for the age that we're living in. We're running out of time, and I have to make sure that I give the co-chairs and our special guest just room for some closing thoughts. Stephen Hadley, thank you again for joining us today. What an honor it is to have you with us. I wonder if you wanted to offer some final thoughts on President Nixon, either his legacy or lessons we can take from him to face today's challenges.
Well, you know, I give you one that really comes from the Foreign Affairs article that you recommended to us. And as Monica said, Nixon was clearly about American leadership as being essential for the world, American strength being the foundation of that leadership. All that is true. In some sense, peace through strengths before Ronald Reagan even got there. But, you know, he was also realistic about how America has to conduct itself and how America has to use that strength in the world in order to bring the world to where we needed it to be in order to carry out the peacemaking missions that he had in mind. And he talked about it in this article about the need for an Asian security structure, which built on what he saw as the real progress made by democratic countries in the region. And he said, and I quote, "In a design for Asia's future, there's no room for heavy-handed American pressures. There's a need for subtle encouragement of the kind of Asian initiatives that help bring the design for a structure to reality. The central pattern of the future in U.S.-Asian relations must be American support for Asian initiatives." And I think what's interesting about that is his subtle appreciation of how we needed to go about using our power and using our leadership in partnership so that we would get buy-in and support from the countries in Asia that we needed if we were going to be successful in the policies we were pursuing. So he was a realist, both in how we dealt with our enemies and our adversaries, and a realist of how subtle we needed to be in how we used our power if we were going to be effective.
Ambassador O'Brien, to you.
Well, thank you. And be part of the seminar for these several years. And I think people can look at Nixon's life. If you want to be inspired as an American, look at this kid who grew up in a very poor area of Orange County. If you go to the Nixon Library, maybe you'll get lucky and get a tour of the upstairs where he and his brother shared a little tiny attic room. And he went to college, worked his way through school, played football, served in the military in World War II in the naval service. He loved his country and served his country his whole life and stayed in politics and stayed in the arena in a tough time. It was anti-communism time. It was the McCarthy era. It was the slings and arrows that were thrown at him were tremendous. And then he had the Vietnam War, but he served the country the whole time. I think a lot of, like Mike Pompeo and Stephen Hadley, the two great colleagues I got on the seminar tonight, who served the country their whole lives and worn themselves out with service. They're examples as well. But look at that Nixon example and stay in the fight, stay in the arena. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt talked about not being one of those cold and timid souls who know neither victory or defeat. A lot of people are upset right now. They're cynical about politics. They've seen what happened in New York over the weekend or the past week and are disappointed in our political system, and rightly so. But don't get cynical. Don't drop out. Stay involved in politics. Stay involved in foreign policy. Stay in the fight, as we like to say in the Army. And America will end up number one. I always go back to that great Ronald Reagan quote when they asked how the Cold War ends, and he said, "We win, they lose." And I think the same thing will be true with China or Russia or Iran. We're going to win. They're going to lose. But look at Richard Nixon's life as an example of someone literally pulling themselves up from the by their bootstraps to becoming president of the United States. And that's what America's all about. That couldn't happen anywhere else in the world other than the United States of America. What a great example for all of us.
Excuse me. Secretary Pompeo, we'd love for you to close us out.
I'll do this. Well, first of all, thank you all for tonight, for being with us, everyone watching. There's no need to pretend or be jingoistic or falsely proud of America to close on the central idea that, Richard Nixon made a little bit of money playing poker, at least so the stories go. He was always long America. He always wagered on the American vision for the world. And as I've traveled the world, talked to folks, they're counting on America as well. They're willing to be right alongside of us. They simply need us to stand up, lead, and do so in a way that is fundamentally decent. And as the history of America has always proven, be that force for good in the world. I'm convinced we will. I'm convinced that'll lead to another great century of Western leadership with the United States in the front. And when we get that right, I'm convinced that the legacy of Richard Nixon will prove something that we all are so proud we were a small part of in this seminar series as well.
Thank you, sir. I've lost my voice as my emotion is getting the better of me. Thank you, everyone, for listening. Thank you to the co-chairs, the Nixon Foundation, and all of you. We've enjoyed every moment, and I hope you have too. I'm Mary Kissel. Good night.
Thank you, Mary.